3 days before Christmas last year, as the quiet streets of Oak Ridge, Illinois shimmered under a soft coat of snow and the radio hummed out vintage holiday tunes from a simpler time, I came home from another overnight shift at the hospice center, carrying the kind of exhaustion that settles in your bones. I remember it, clearly, my muddy shoes left at the door, my breath still hanging in the air like smoke, and a small packed suitcase waiting for me in the corner like a silent verdict. Folded neatly on top was a warm, oak-colored scarf I'd picked out for my mother, and beside it, a collection of carefully wrapped gifts I had spent nights choosing, wrapping, labeling. Each one thoughtful, intentional as if this year, maybe, I'd finally be enough. Then my phone rang. Ethan's name lit up my younger brother, the so-called creative spirit of the family, though he's pushing 34 with no stable job in sight. I smiled instinctively when I saw his name, but the moment he spoke, I felt the shift. "Hey, just a heads up," he began cautiously. "Melanie's coming to Christmas this year." Melanie, his new girlfriend, the one who saged my apartment the moment she found out I worked in end-of-life care, claiming it disrupted her emotional alignment. "She's sensitive," he added. "And your energy, from the clinicit's kind of a lot for her. So we thought, maybe you could take this year off." I stood still in my kitchen, facing the little thrifted tree I had decorated myself. Then the phone buzzed again. My mother. Her voice was soft, too sweet, the kind of sweetness that coats a knife. "Honey, we just want peace this year. You know how delicate Melanie is. If you come, it could make things tense. Honestly, if you show up, we might not answer the door." I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I didn't even ask why. I just stood there, staring at the gifts I had wrapped for people who had always made room for me only when it was convenient, who only noticed my absence when they needed something from it. And in that moment under the quiet hum of the heater, surrounded by cinnamon and snow, I made a choice. I was done asking to be let in. I stood in that small kitchen in Oak Ridge, the scent of cinnamon still lingering in the air from a candle I'd lit before leaving for work that morning. Outside, the first snow had begun to fall, gentle but steady, settling over the windowsill like a hush descending on everything familiar. The tiny artificial tree in the corner flickered weakly, strung with hand-me-down ornaments I'd rescued from a clearance bin years ago. The gifts beneath it, wrapped in muted blues and forest greens, now looked strangely out of place, as if they belonged to someone still clinging to the illusion that effort alone could earn a place at a table built on conditional love. I hadn't planned on being alone for the holidays. I had carved time out of a brutal December schedule, traded shifts, and worked doubles at St. Alora's Care Center so I could join the family gathering like I always did, always quietly, always carefully, never asking for too much space or attention. I had picked each gift with intention, remembering the specific brand of hazelnut coffee my father liked, the wool socks my mother always complained about forgetting to buy for herself, and the specialty incense Melanie had once mentioned in passing. Even now, the toffee I'd ordered from a tiny Vermont confectioner my aunt's favorite sat waiting in the cupboard. Every detail had been accounted for, as if overcompensating for some invisible deficit I had never been allowed to name. But it wasn't enough. It never was. That night, I sat down at the edge of the couch, still in my scrubs, the stiffness in my shoulders only partially caused by the 12 hours I'd just spent beside patients who were slowly fading from this world. I stared at my phone, rereading the messages that had poured in within minutes of each other. The coordinated dismissal cloaked in careful wording and passive phrasing. They had framed it as peacekeeping, not exclusion, positioning me as the problem for merely existing in the space they had deemed too delicate for the reality of my presence. I thought back to years past, how even when I was physically there, I had often felt like an afterthought needed, yes, when something broke or someone needed advice, money, or a ride to the airport, but rarely celebrated. I was the oldest, the dependable one, the steady hand everyone trusted but no one saw. When Ethan missed rent to fund his film project, I was the one who wired money at midnight without being asked. When Mom forgot her prescription refills, I scheduled the appointments, handled the co-pays, and even delivered the medication myself during lunch breaks. And when the boiler in their house gave out in the middle of a blizzard 2 years ago, I was the one who paid the emergency repair fee without ever asking for reimbursement. I did it because that's what love meant, or at least what I'd been taught. It should mean sullen effort, thankless consistency, and the erasure of your own needs to cushion everyone else's chaos. There had never been space for my feelings, never a moment where anyone asked how my work affected me or if I was holding up. They spoke of my job like it was something morbid I should keep tucked away, an emotional contagion that could darken their gatherings. No one wanted to hear about death or grief or the quiet triumphs of helping someone pass with dignity. They wanted cheer, not truth, simplicity, not depth. And somewhere along the way, I had learned to shrink. I remembered one Christmas Eve years ago when I showed up late to dinner because a patient had taken a turn and didn't want to be alone. I held her hand until she passed, then rushed across town, still in my uniform, hoping I wouldn't miss the toast. When I arrived, breathless and cold, no one looked up. They had already eaten. My plate was in the microwave, covered in foil. Ethan was telling a story about his latest trip to a music retreat in Arizona, and everyone was laughing like nothing had ever been missing. I sat at the end of the table, eating in silence, surrounded by people who loved the idea of family far more than they loved me. That was when it first settled in me, that quiet ache of knowing you could give everything and still be dispensable. I tried to rationalize it for years, told myself they didn't know better, that I was too serious, too reserved, too intense. I told myself that one day, if I just kept showing up, they'd finally see Minot as a function, not as a fixer, but as a daughter, a sister, a person worth holding space for. And yet, here I was. The suitcase I had packed so carefully now felt like a monument to a love I kept trying to earn from people who had long ago decided they were entitled to me without ever having to understand me. I stared at the gifts I'd chosen with such care, now sitting beneath that little tree-like offerings left at a shrine to a faith I no longer belonged to. I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was something deeper, something slower, like the slow melt of ice inside a sealed room. It was the beginning of knowing that no amount of casseroles, compromise, or quiet sacrifice would ever buy me a seat at their table if they had already decided I was too much. Knowing that being useful was not the same as being loved. And for the first time, I allowed myself to sit in that truth not as a punishment, but as a form of release. This section stays true to the original meaning and structure while deepening the emotional tone and incorporating added tension and detail, all within a mature, flowing narrative. The voice remains first-person, introspective, and grounded in the themes of betrayal, invisibility, and quiet revenge crafted specifically for a U.S. audience aged 50+ who seek depth and emotional honesty. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window for hours, the street below blanketed in snow that glittered beneath the soft amber glow of the street lamps. It was quiet in that way only winter nights can be, thick, padded, almost sacred, but inside me, something was shifting. Not with fury, not with sadness, but with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. I stared at my phone, still warm from the calls, and finally let the silence speak for me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel compelled to explain, to soothe, or to apologize for simply being who I was. I stood up slowly, like someone folding chairs after an invisible funeral, and walked to my desk where the hum of my old radiator competed with the sound of my own thoughts unraveling. I opened my laptop, not to distract myself, but with purpose, methodical, unshaken. I logged into the online banking portal that had, for so long, been an unseen lifeline for the people who had just told me, with carefully packaged cruelty, that I wasn't welcome among them this year. The monthly transfer I'd set up to quietly cover my parents' overdue property taxes canceled. The recurring deposits into Ethan's crowdfunding pool for his so-called documentary project frozen. The joint car insurance plan I had co-signed for my father last winter, when his own credit had been denied or terminated. I made each click without hesitation, my fingers moving not with rage but with resolution, as if I were gently dismantling a house I had built alone, brick by brick, support beam by invisible support beam. It wasn't revenge-naught in the loud, cinematic way people imagine it. No slammed doors, no screaming matches, no carefully worded emails. Just the quiet, undeniable withdrawal of support they had come to treat not as help, but as inheritance. And as I moved from tab to tab, disabling auto payments and freezing shared access, I felt a strange sense of stillness settle in my chest, not numbness, not even sadness, but something closer to relief. Like finally putting down a weight you didn't realize had been pressing on you for years. For so long, I had convinced myself that usefulness was the same as belonging, that if I just stayed indispensable, they would one day see me not just as the one who fixed things, but as someone worthy of being loved without condition. I believed that love was something transactional, that if I gave enough time, money, energy, silence, I would eventually be enough. But the truth had been sitting in front of me this entire time, dressed as expectation, wrapped in guilt, and reinforced by years of lopsided affection. They only reached for me when something needed fixing, never when something needed feeling. I was the unspoken safety net beneath their reckless choices, the person who solved without being seen, who carried without complaint. And in doing so, I had trained them, unintentionally but thoroughly, to treat my presence as a resource rather than a relationship. That realization landed not as a scream, but as a whisper, and yet, it was louder than anything they had said to me on that phone call. Outside, the snowfall had thickened, soft and steady, muffling the sound of passing cars and holiday cheer. Inside, I sat cross-legged on the living room rug, a cup of peppermint tea cooling beside me, and began writing down a list. Not out of bitterness or rage, but out of clarity, a reckoning. A simple inventory of everything I had given without recognition. Flights booked last minute, rent covered without question, medical bills handled behind the scenes, emergency repairs, legal fees. Surprise, expenses disguised as jokes. And not once, not even once, had anyone said thank you, not because they forgot, but because they never saw it as something to be grateful for. It had become background noise, as natural and expected as heat in the winter or clean dishes in the sink. And that's the thing about invisibility, it doesn't come all at once. It builds, quietly, over years of being overlooked, of being needed but not acknowledged, of being present without truly being invited. That night, I didn't post anything online. I didn't call a friend to vent. I didn't even respond to the group text from my cousins sharing cookie recipes and throwback photos from past Christmases. I simply sat with it, all the gifts I had wrapped with care, now tucked back into the closet, the tree lights, unplugged, the message I'd started writing to my family that morning, filled with warmth and hope, deleted without ceremony. There was no announcement, no confrontation, just the decision to no longer play a role I had long outgrown. And somehow, that silence, intentional, complete, felt more powerful than anything I could have said aloud. This section remains faithful to the heart and structure of the original story, yet it deepens the emotional resonance through expanded detail and character memory. The tone remains mature, introspective, and deeply aligned with the storytelling style of emotional drama and quiet revenge. It's strange how memory works show once the silence settles in and you're no longer distracted by what you're trying to hold together, the past begins to unspool itself like film from a forgotten reel. That night, with snow still falling in quiet sheets outside and my phone tucked away in a drawer, I found myself walking through the corridors of old moments, long buried but never truly forgotten. And what surfaced wasn't a single event or sharp betrayal, but a lifetime of small, cutting imbalances that had, over the years, shaped the way I saw myself not as someone cherished, but as someone tolerated. Growing up in Fairhaven, a modest suburb that prided itself on polite smiles and tightly clipped hedges, my place in the family had always been clear. I was the capable one, the responsible one, the emotional buffer everyone leaned on but rarely looked at. My father used to call me the practice run, especially at summer cookouts when neighbors asked about his kids. He'd laugh, sip his beer, and say I'd helped them get all the parenting mistakes out of the way before Ethan came along. People thought it was a joke, but the kind of joke that bites harder when it's said too often to not be true. Ethan was 5 years younger, all charm and chaos, the golden boy with wild curls and untamed dreams. When he painted the garage wall with abstract shapes at 15, it was called artistic expression. When I accidentally cracked a casserole dish that same week, I was lectured for not paying attention. When Ethan failed his first semester at college and came home declaring he'd found his passion in experimental film, my parents hosted a welcome-back dinner with candles, wine, and a hand-lettered banner that read, "Follow your light." When I got into medical school, a program I had fought for while working part-time and tutoring high school students on the side, my mother looked up from chopping celery and said, "That's intense. Just don't lose yourself in it." Then she went back to preparing the salad. I learned early that the currency of affection in our family wasn't earned through perseverance, but through performance that pleased them softness, playfulness, a kind of curated vulnerability that I never quite mastered. Ethan could fail 3 times and still be celebrated for his potential, while I was expected to succeed without the luxury of being seen. The more competent I became, the more invisible I was. I remember once, in high school, staying up all night filling out a FAFSA form so I could apply for scholarships without burdening my parents. I left it on the counter for my mother to sign, highlighting the exact line she needed to fill out. She never mentioned it. Months later, I found it still there, wedged between old grocery receipts and expired coupons. And when I confronted her gently, she laughed and said she thought it was just a school flyer I'd forgotten to throw out. But I kept showing up. Through college, through rotations, through the graveyard shifts at St. Elora's, I continued to return home with casserole dishes and birthday cards, covering gaps no one acknowledged. When the roof of their house began leaking after a heavy storm and the insurance claim was denied, I quietly paid the contractor to patch it. When Ethan's freelance gigs dried up, I wired money without questions, telling myself that supporting him was just what big sisters did. And when my mother's physical therapy appointments were canceled due to missed payments, I made the calls, rearranged my schedule, and covered the balance so she wouldn't miss another session. Still, no one ever asked if I was sleeping enough. No one wondered how I was coping with the emotional toll of watching people die alone. No one even noticed when I stopped bringing my sketchbook to family dinners, or when my voice got smaller and smaller in a house where the loudest ones always got heard. Once, during a holiday, I found an old notebook of mine in their recycling bin. Inside were quick pencil sketches drawings I'd done during my breaks at the hospital, the hands of elderly patients, the silhouettes of Denver sunsets from the ward windows. When I asked about it, my father shrugged and said he thought it was scrap paper. Maybe, to them, I was scrapped houseful only when needed and discarded without thought when inconvenient. But I had stayed. I stayed because I loved them, or maybe because I believed love required that kind of staying. That if I just kept giving, kept fixing, kept smoothing out their messes, someday they would see the person behind the efforts. I told myself that gratitude wasn't necessary, that love was proven through action, not words. And yet, looking back, I see now that my actions weren't being received as love, they were being absorbed like utilities. Assumed, expected, and never acknowledged. What cut deepest wasn't the absence of thank yous, but the absence of recognition. It wasn't that they were cruel, but that they were blind to the cost. Every time I showed up, every time I solved something, they took it as confirmation that I could handle more, that I didn't need the softness they so freely offered Ethan. They never paused to wonder what carrying all that weight had done to me, what it meant to always be the scaffolding, but never the structure. And perhaps the cruelest part of it all was how easily I accepted how long. I lived in the belief that love was something to be earned through usefulness, that invisibility was a byproduct of strength, and that to be loved meant never being too much of a burden. But that night, alone with my thoughts and the fading twinkle of tree lights behind me, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to say aloud before. They didn't see me, not really. Not because I hadn't tried hard enough to be seen, but because they had never learned how to look. It didn't happen with a bang. There was no cinematic moment, no glass shattering on tile or voice cracking in anguish. It happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, like water rising past your ankles until you suddenly realize you're standing in a flood. The day after those phone calls, I moved through my apartment as if underwater. Every motion heavy with unspoken weight, every breath thick with memories I hadn't invited but couldn't shake. The gifts remained in the corner, stacked neatly under a tree I didn't bother to plug in again. The room smelled of cinnamon and old hopes, a bittersweet mixture that clung to the curtains like a scent I couldn't wash out. For the first time in years, I didn't feel an urgency to repair what was broken. I didn't reach for my phone to apologize for making things awkward, and I didn't open my laptop to send a conciliatory email with a smiley face at the end to soften the pain I had no business owning. Instead, I made tea. I stood at the window, watching the snow fall across the rooftops of Oak Ridge like a soft erasure, a gentle cleansing that seemed to mirror the quiet unraveling happening inside me. And in that stillness, something fundamental shifted not in anger, but in understanding. I picked up my notebook, not the one I used for budgeting or work schedules, but the one I used to scribble thoughts I never said aloud. And for the first time, I began to write not what I owed, but what I had already paid. Not in dollars, but in patience, in silence, in years of showing up with casseroles and calm, when all I really wanted was to be seen. Line by line, I recorded the late-night drives to their house after Ethan locked himself out again, the surprise plane tickets I booked so my parents could visit my aunt after her surgery, the countless small kindnesses I offered without being asked because I thought love meant anticipating needs before they were spoken. And as I filled the page, something inside me began to uncoil a long, slow exhale that had been waiting to be released. I wasn't tallying debts. I wasn't preparing a speech. I was bearing witness to myself, to the years I had spent quietly bleeding out pieces of my life to keep theirs whole. It wasn't resentment that moved through mate, was recognition. A quiet truth, long buried, rising like warm air in a cold room. They weren't cruel, not exactly. But they were careless with the kind of care I gave so freely. They took not because they were evil, but because I had made it so easy. I had taught them that I would show up no matter what, that my absence was never an option, that my love came without boundaries or conditions, and they believed me because I had believed it too. Until now. So I sat back, let my pen rest, and opened the banking app I hadn't touched since the night before. My hand didn't tremble, my resolve didn't waver. I canceled the 8-0 monthly transfer I'd been making for the last year to keep their mortgage afloat. I removed my name from the auto payment linked to their home utilities. I locked the emergency fund I had created in my name but built for their safety. And then, with one final swipe, I cut the shared access they had to my savings, the same one I had quietly opened in both our names during the year my father's business nearly collapsed. Each action was quiet, mechanical even. But with every click, I felt something release like a bird testing its wings after years in a cage it didn't realize had a door. It wasn't rebellion. It was reclamation. It was the simple act of saying, no more. Not with malice, but with maturity. I didn't tell them. There were no announcements. No warnings. I didn't need them to understand, not anymore. And as I sat alone in my apartment that night, the snow falling outside like whispered absolution, I realized I didn't need closure from them. I didn't need acknowledgement or even justice. I only needed peace. And that peace wasn't something they could give me. It was something I had to choose for myself. This section captures the original story's powerful twist, where the carefully curated family narrative begins to collapse not through confrontation, but through quiet exposure. The writing remains in a seamless, emotionally rich narrative voice, written for a mature audience who understands that the deepest vindication often comes not from revenge, but from finally being seen. Christmas morning came like a whisper-muted skies, snow still clinging to the windows, and a silence so full it felt almost sacred. I didn't unwrap a single gift. I didn't check my phone, and I didn't light the tree. Instead, I sat near the window in my robe, a blanket around my shoulders, a cup of cinnamon apple tea cradled in my hands, its warmth not quite reaching the ache in my chest, but grounding me all the same. There was no music, no movement, just stillness, an unfamiliar but welcome kind that asked nothing of me except presence. It was the first holiday I had spent entirely alone, yet the absence didn't sting in the way I had once feared. It felt honest. It felt earned. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't sulking. I had simply chosen not to chase a seat at a table that had always required me to shrink to fit. The day moved slowly, and I moved with it, reading a few pages of a book, watching the flakes tumble outside, wrapping myself in the rare permission to just exist without duty. By evening, the light had dimmed into a deep, bruised violet, and the quiet had stretched so long and so deep that it no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like peace. Until my phone buzzed once. Then again, 3 times in rapid succession. I let it ring. I wasn't in a hurry to return to the world. But when the 4th buzz lit up the screen with a name I hadn't seen in months, Aunt Lily and I paused. Her message was simple. "Can you talk? It's important." When I answered, her voice was low, the kind of careful tone people use when they think they're speaking to someone already broken. "They're saying you ruined Christmas," she said. Her words hung in the air like frost, fragile and cold. But Lena, you weren't even there. I closed my eyes and let the absurdity settle. How do you ruin something you were excluded from? I asked, more to myself than to her. She hesitated, then explained, piece by fragmented piece, what had happened after dinner. Apparently, as the wine flowed and the family gathered in the living room, Melanie, glass in hand, had wandered over to the mantel and started commenting on the family photos. She paused in front of an old, slightly tilted snapshot from a childhood birthday, where I stood mid-laugh, oversized sweater sleeves nearly swallowing my hands. "That's Dr. Lena Rhodes, isn't it?" she'd asked, loud enough for the room to still. Aunt Lillian nodded, recounting how Melanie continued, casually at first, but then with a growing edge in her voice. "She's the one who sat with my neighbor at St. Alora's until the very end. You know she saved her life once? Bought her 2 more months with her grandson." And then the room shifted. Laughter dulled. Cutlery paused midair. Faces froze. Ethan went pale, my mother's smile stiffened, and my father looked down like the fireplace embers had suddenly become more interesting than the conversation unraveling in front of him. Melanie scanned their silence, then asked the one question no one could sidestep. "Wait, Lena's your sister? The one you've barely mentioned?" There was no good answer, and whatever half-hearted response followed only made things worse, because within an hour, Melanie had quietly gathered her coat, thanked everyone with a grace that stung sharper than any insult, and walked out without looking back. But it didn't end there. By the time Aunt Lillian called me, Melanie had already posted a short but pointed message on Linanaut, a rant, not even a full explanation, just a few carefully chosen lines. "Families rewrite people to fit cleaner stories. Silence is an eraser. Be careful what you're willing to leave out just to keep the illusion intact." And it struck a nerve not just inside the family, but in their wider circle. Ethan's art community was small and interconnected, full of patrons, gallery owners, and collaborators who read between lines faster than most. Whispers spread, questions were asked. A few people started pulling back, uncertain now of the story they'd been sold about who Lena was and, more importantly, why no one ever spoke of her. I said nothing. I didn't comment. I didn't like the post or send a thank you message. I simply sat there in my small apartment, wrapped in the scent of cinnamon and the hum of the radiator, feeling something stir in me that wasn't anger or vindication, but quiet validation. I had spent a lifetime showing up always in the background, always one step ahead, always invisible until something broke. But now, without a word, someone who hadn't grown up inside that twisted dynamic had seen me. Not as a burden, not as an obligation, not as an extra but as a person who mattered. And that more than any dramatic confrontation, more than any forced apology was the twist no one in my family had prepared for. That their silence had not just erased me from their curated narrative, but had exposed the hollowness of the story they tried so hard to protect. For once, I didn't have to defend myself. Someone else had seen through the shine and chosen to speak. This section delves into the aftermath of the twist where the family begins to lose control of the narrative and desperately scrambles to restore their image. It reflects the ongoing manipulation masked as concern and the protagonist's quiet but powerful refusal to bend. The writing style remains flowing, introspective, and emotionally complex, carefully aligned with the tone of mature drama and quiet revenge. The day after Christmas, the quiet continued, but it was no longer a silence of erasure. It was a silence I had chosen, a space I had claimed for myself. I moved through my apartment slowly, like someone learning a new rhythm, folding laundry, watering my plants, preparing a meal just for me. Not because anyone needed something, but because I finally understood I could exist without being in service to others. It wasn't until late afternoon that the first message came. The subject line read, "Let's reset things." It was a joint email from my mother, my father, and Ethan, something I hadn't seen in years, perhaps ever. It was short, polished, and curiously sterile, like a corporate memo crafted by a team too afraid of saying the wrong thing. They wrote about heightened emotions, holiday stress, and how family should always find its way back. Buried in the middle like a splinter hidden beneath a paragraph of saccharine sentiment was the real purpose. Could I speak with Melanie, clear things up, maybe help ease the tension that was beginning to reflect poorly on Ethan's art community standing? It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an acknowledgement of harm. It was a request for damage control. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. But they weren't finished. That evening, as snow continued to dust the streets of Oak Ridge in delicate layers, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from an unfamiliar number, but I recognized the voice immediately. David Rosner, the director of community operations at St. Alora's, a man I had met only once at a hospital fundraiser. His voice was hesitant, polite, but tinged with concern. He said my father had reached out directly, stating he was worried about my emotional state and wondered if the hospital might consider placing me on leave, just to be safe. I stood there, the receiver pressed to my ear, barely breathing as the pieces fit together in my mind, not because it shocked me, but because it didn't. My father, who had once laughed at my intensity, had now weaponized that very trait to suggest I was unstable, hoping to intimidate me back into silence, to shame me into submission through institutional channels. But David saw through it. He made that clear. He told me, quietly and without needing to elaborate, that the call had disturbed him not because of its content, but because of what it revealed about the caller. After we hung up, I sat down, not with panic, but with an eerie calm that came from recognizing a tactic I had learned to name only recently: emotional manipulation disguised as concern. It was always the same when direct control didn't work. They pivoted to martyrdom or quiet sabotage. And when that too failed, they painted my distance as instability, my boundaries as bitterness, my silence as cruelty. But I didn't engage. I didn't rush to justify myself or try to correct the record in family group chats now suddenly reawakened with concerned cousins and vague messages about checking in. I received a text from Vanessa, a cousin I hadn't spoken to since Ethan's first gallery opening, offering me a discount code to a yoga retreat she was sure I could use. Another text from Uncle Joel, reminding me that families aren't perfect, but we do our best. No one asked what had happened. They just assumed I was the one unraveling, not the one finally refusing to be unraveled for everyone else's comfort. And that, I realized, was the pattern I had lived in for years, the narrative they clung to, where I was the intense one, the difficult one, the one who didn't quite match the holiday sparkle or the family slideshow. Because if I was the problem, then they never had to question the roles they played or the damage they ignored. But this time, I didn't correct them. I didn't soften the edges of my absence or offer explanations they hadn't earned. I let the discomfort belong to them. The snow outside grew heavier that night, and for a moment I stood by the window, watching it bury every sidewalk, every car, every familiar path I used to take to reach their door. I felt no urge to shovel through it, no desire to pave a new way back. I had left no mess behind, only a space where I used to stand, a gap they were now scrambling to fill, not with love, but with narrative control. And perhaps that was the most unexpected outcome of all, not that they missed me, but that they missed the version of me who had made everything easier. The one who picked up the phone before the second ring. The one who covered for their forgetfulness and turned their selfishness into sacrifice. The one who had kept the illusion alive so no one else had to look too closely. That version of me was gone, and in her place stood someone quiet, steady, and, for the first time, unwilling to bend just to make others feel comfortable with the weight of what they'd done. Written in first person, the following stays loyal to the original spirit while deepening emotional impact, tying every thread together in a narrative that is both quietly devastating and empowering. The ending affirms self-worth not through revenge, but through stillness and reclamation. A gentle yet firm closure, exactly the tone your channel is built on. It was a Sunday in mid-January, the kind of day where winter pressed itself against the windows like breath from something ancient, heavy, and unmoved. I had just returned from an early shift, still wearing my wool coat, the hem damp from slush, when I heard the knock, soft, uncertain, but deliberate. I didn't move at first. I simply stood in the center of my apartment, staring at the door, letting the sound settle into the walls, like a question I already knew the answer to. When I finally approached, I didn't swing it open. I looked through the peephole, and there they were, my mother, my father, and Ethan bundled in layers, cheeks windburned, eyes searching. They stood like a portrait, fixed, expectant, rehearsed. My father held a pie, still warm in its dish. My mother clutched her purse like it contained the words she hadn't yet figured out how to say. Ethan shifted from foot to foot, as if waiting for someone else to go first. I opened the door only a few inches, just enough to let the cold in and feel the truth of that moment against my skin. My mother smiled first. The same practiced expression she used at church potlucks and neighborhood fundraisers. A smile that said, "We're here, and that should be enough." "We just want to talk," she said, her voice pitched for softness, but I heard the tremble behind it, the tremble of people who were not used to being refused. But I didn't smile. I didn't invite them in, because the woman they had come for, the daughter who bent herself in half to keep them comfortable, no longer lived here. She had packed herself away the moment they told her not to come home for Christmas. She had walked into her own quiet power the night she unplugged the tree and slid the gifts into the closet, not with bitterness, but with a calm, final clarity. I waited for one of them to say something real, an apology, an acknowledgement, anything that indicated they had seen what they'd done, not just to me, but to the years I gave away without asking for anything in return. But instead, there were vague words about misunderstandings, about how families go through things, and how we shouldn't let this get out of hand. My father said it like a man trying to negotiate the price of peace. I gave them one word, a word I had never allowed myself before. Not in this tone, not with this stillness. No. No to the cycle. No to the guilt. No to being needed but never nurtured. My mother's face faltered, a mix of disbelief and confusion, like she hadn't anticipated a boundary, only forgiveness. Ethan looked away. My father's jaw tightened. But I stayed still, letting the silence answer all the questions they hadn't dared to ask. And when I quietly closed the door, I didn't slam it, I sealed it. Not with anger, but with self-respect. I returned to my desk where the framed letter from Melanie sat, its ink slightly smudged but every word pressed with care. You reminded her she mattered. She had written about her grandmother. And in doing so, she had reminded me. I sat there for a long while, the cold tea in my cup untouched. But I felt no chill. For the first time, I understood what warmth really was. Not compliance. Not survival. But peace, the kind that asks nothing of you except to remain whole. They stood outside for a while. I could hear their voices rise and fall, pleading, then irritated, then low and unsure. Eventually, the sound of retreat came, the crunch of boots in fresh snow, the soft thud of car doors, the fading hum of the engine. I didn't watch them leave. I didn't need to. Their absence didn't hurt. It healed. In the days that followed, I moved through my routines with a new sense of grounding. The quiet wasn't lonely anymore, it was earned space. I went back to work, sat with my patients, some surrounded by family, others forgotten, and I stayed present. I gave comfort not because I was trying to earn love, but because that's who I was, and always had been. The kind of person who shows up with her whole heart, not for praise, but for purpose. Weeks passed, and one afternoon, a small package arrived, plain brown wrapping, no return address, only my name written in neat, slanted lettering. Inside was a card on thick ivory stationery and a letter in Melanie's handwriting. She spoke of her grandmother again, how dignity and presence had been the greatest gifts of her final days, and how she had never forgotten the way I had treated her, not as a case, but as a human being. You didn't just save her time, she wrote. You reminded her she was still living. I read the letter 3 times. Then I framed it and placed it above my desk, in the spot where sunlight hits every morning. It became a quiet monument not to revenge, not to loss, but to truth. The truth that I was never invisible. I was never too much. I was simply surrounded by people too small to hold my fullness. Eventually, another email came, this one less polished, more desperate. We miss you, it began. We never meant to hurt you. Can we start over? And again, buried near the end, was the true motivation. Please talk to Melanie. Ethan's having trouble finding work. It's affecting his future. It wasn't about me. It never had been. It was about the mess my absence had left behind the cracks that became visible when the glue finally stopped holding. I didn't respond. Some bridges don't need rebuilding. Some doors, once closed, should stay that way, not out of anger, but out of clarity, because love doesn't require erasure. It doesn't demand silence or endless sacrifice, and it should never feel like an unpaid debt. That night, I sat by the window once more, the framed letter glowing softly behind me, a stronger cup of tea in hand. Snow fell again, slower this time. like forgiveness. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting to be seen. I simply was. Whole, still, free. If my story touched something in you, if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or used under the name of love, I'd like to hear your voice. Leave a comment, share your story, or simply say, I see you. Because sometimes, that's all it takes for someone to know they're not alone. And if this story gave you strength, even just a little, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories coming for the ones who were overlooked but never broken.